Okay, so let's go to the most important question, maybe. How to learn Dutch effectively according to science. And I looked a lot at different research papers already for many years. It's kind of my hobby. And I checked it with Carmen Klein-Herenbrink. She's in the meeting. She knows more than me. So if something is wrong, then she'll let me know. Here, there's a little overview, what we're going to look at. So if we want to know how to learn Dutch according to science, well, first let's define what do we mean with Dutch in general. So on the left, you see that the Dutch language, we could say it consists of these three things, right? There's words, then there's the sounds of those words, and then there's the structures in which we put them together. Makes sense, right? Then on the right side, there's the things that we do. So we kind of do grammar in a sense that there are structures and we put it together. You could say that that's grammar. I mean, there are many definitions of grammar. But here I try to use this active definition. Then we pronounce words and we do these four things, right? Speak, write, listen, and read. And I'll try to show you what, in general, are the conclusions of linguistic research of how to do it, of how to learn these things in general, right? And therefore, we're going to look at three hypotheses, okay? But to understand these three hypotheses, I would like to look first at a more super important distinction made by this man, Stephen Krashen. And it's also the introduction of the first hypothesis. So now we're getting into the science part, okay? If I don't make sense, please write it in the chat. But let's go to the science part. So what we first need to understand is the distinction of learning and acquiring, okay? It was popularized by this man, but already before people were talking about it. And the idea is that there's a difference between conscious, intentional, explicit learning and then subconscious, incidental, implicit learning. So in general, what we mean by learning is that you have a text, for example, and you use your effort, right, to understand the text, to translate, to write sentences. So you focus on how to write those sentences or which forms of the verbs are used, right? That's formal. Focus on form. And you do it intensively, usually, not always. So what you do is translate and try to find out, really putting a lot of time and effort in what this text means. So that is in general learning, right? And we do this mostly in a traditional classroom. The idea is that it's very different from another process. So learning is one process, and then we have the acquiring process. And he says, Stephen Krashen, he says it's completely different. We're doing this subconsciously, without effort, informally, right? So we're just walking on the street, we're reading things, it's more or less random, and we're seeing new words the whole time, but we're not trying to learn them, right? We're just trying to understand where we have to go. And we see something there, and we're like, we have to go to the right. Okay, more or less like this. So it's we focus on meaning, not on form. And usually we do it extensively. So probably when you're reading in your own language, you're acquiring, you're not learning. Because you're reading a book, you're not trying to find out the past tense or the future tense. You're not trying to learn new words or anything like that, but you're just acquiring them. You're picking them up, as they say, right? Picking up new words. And that's all here. And there are also some teaching methods based on acquiring instead of learning. So this is one of them, teaching physical response systems. But there are a lot more. So when we understand this, we could say, according to Krashen, we could say that on the left is how we learn in classrooms and how we learn as adults. And on the right is how we learn as children, how we learn our own language. Like the baby, right? Is just playing and learning. Yes, this is easy, right? An old friend while studying linguistics, I see, yeah. Then we can go to the introduction of the input hypothesis. This is the most important idea, I would say, that a lot of other linguists build upon. So we have to understand it. And he writes, and I quote, "We may thus state, parts 1 and 2 of the input hypothesis. 1, the input hypothesis relates to acquisition, not learning, so the subconscious process. 2, we acquire by understanding language that contains structure and it beyond our current level. Structure A beyond our current level of competence. So we see something and then it's a little bit more difficult than we are used to. So we have learned an extra element, I plus one, or input plus one. This is done with the help of context or extra linguistic information. What he means by that, for the ones who don't know, it's just that you use translation or you use your hands. In case of the teacher, use your hands. And this extra linguistic information, so the information outside of the language, helps you to understand the meaning of the message, right? So that's here. And then 3, when communication is successful, so if that works, right, you understand this extra structure, if that's successful, when the input is understood and there is enough of it, not once, but maybe twice, thrice, then it will be provided automatically. So for example, you're reading a text, there's 2 new words, but you understand the text anyway, so you can infer the meaning of those words. Then you've learned some words through input and context. And that's how all language learning works, according to this guy, Stephen Krashen. He says this is the only thing that happens. Okay, so it's very strong, this hypothesis. And then he says, number 4, that your ability to produce emerges. It is not taught directly. So he says when you do this, right, the teacher explains things with the hands, you read a text, you listen to a podcast, slowly, you'll hear new words, you understand them through context. And that's basically how we learn a language. That's what he says. So summarizing, you could say we acquire language when we understand messages. There are people that do this, okay? Especially on YouTube, there's a lot of polyglots there who use only this idea to learn many languages. Some of them get to very high levels, some of them not so high level. So we could say, if we believe that only Krashen is right, okay? We could say, don't study grammar, don't memorize words, don't ask for corrections, don't worry about speaking. Just read and listen to compelling and comprehensible input, and you will be able to speak, okay? So first, more comprehension means more production. And some people on YouTube are still saying this. And for some people, it's true, okay? So I noticed that, for example, my German is pretty good, and all I did was just listening and reading. But of course, German is pretty easy for someone who studied Dutch, right? And I do notice, however, that I make mistakes in German that are quite easy. So I have like high-level German with very easy, simple mistakes. So why is that, right? According to Krashen, that shouldn't happen. I should be able to understand better German. He would say you should understand German even better, and then the errors will solve itself, right? If you are an introvert, your silence helps you to process information better, is what Krashen would say. So my advice is, if you don't like speaking, okay, for everyone that listens now, if you don't like speaking and you're afraid, you have anxiety, just don't, okay, is my advice. Don't practice for now. And then later on, your Dutch will be really pretty good when you practice. So don't listen to everyone that says, no, you have to practice, otherwise you won't get better. It's at some point that will be true, but probably until you're like reading non-fiction books and understanding podcasts about politics, until that level, you'll get better just by reading and listening. So please don't worry. And of course, you do need to study a lot. And at one point you'll need to speak, but we all know that. Why? Otherwise you're learning Dutch, right? So some modern proof of Krashen is this beautiful study from 2002. And they concluded, okay, it was a meta-analysis, as you can see, vocabulary acquisition through viewing captions and subtitled videos, a meta-analysis of lots of studies, 32, I believe. And they concluded that watching videos will not only teach you words and sounds, but also structures. So those people learned a lot of grammar by only watching videos. So again, for the ones of you that don't like speaking and also don't like reading, go ahead and watch a lot of videos. Then intralingual subtitles are best. So videos in Dutch with Dutch subtitles. And they found also that cartoons are best. So find your cartoons and go ahead. My advice is get to the A2 level first, using books. You can use my book, for example, to get there. You can use textbooks and apps or courses, whatever. But when you are there, around more or less A2, please start binge watching Netflix. Okay, it sounds like a little thing you do when you don't have time to actually learn Dutch, right? But it's not true. You will actually learn so many things just by watching Netflix. So please do, okay? I noticed that many of my students are not doing it. Please do. Or you can find a simple book. According to Crash, it will also work. A simple book. You can relax your mind, engage into the story without analyzing. You can lose a little translation here in case you don't understand the book. And you can listen on Spotify. So my book has also audiobook. That will also work. So videos or something like this. Now the question is, of course, was he completely right? And there's this study, Krashen 40 years later, by these two people, Lichtman and Van Patten. And they concluded, yes, okay, mostly. But there are some things we have to look at. They say the fundamental role of input, the acquisition-learning distinction, now understood as explicit-implicit distinction, are irrefutable observations about second language learning acquisition. And I noticed that pretty much in all the studies, pretty much everyone agrees that it's super important to have lots of input. So if there's one thing you have to do to learn Dutch, okay, something that is necessary, then it's massive input. Everybody agrees. But then there are some other things that maybe you also need to do, or some things that can help you to get to the highest level, to make sure you don't make mistakes like I do in German, or to make sure that you're completely proficient, for example, in a working environment and things like that. So there are some things that input maybe cannot give you. And what do we see in the studies? Well, we see that some people that do this, according to Krashen, just reading a lot and things like that, they get really good and others don't. So results differ. Then we see some people do not get to a high level. So sometimes it's not sufficient. And we notice that the knowledge those people have after reading and listening a lot is not always robust. And it's robust, it means that the knowledge is incidental, meaning that sometimes they remember a word easily. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they can understand a grammar rule just from reading. Sometimes they don't, right? And they cannot always explain, so they cannot always declare their knowledge or do it in every situation. So that means it's not declarative or procedural knowledge. So now we have the most important thing, but it's not enough. So let's look at two other hypotheses and try to make it more complete. Are all of you guys still asleep or you're still here? Just checking. Yes, okay. Nice. I'm used to teaching interactively, you know, so it's very weird for me. But I see some smiles. Okay, nice. So Krashen was right, but input is not always sufficient. So that's why someone else came up with the output hypothesis. So we're going to look at that. And how you read and listen is important. Okay, so some people read and listen but never understand. Or for example, if you turn on the radio in Dutch right now, the rest of your life, the chances are you won't learn Dutch, even there's maximum input, right? Now, of course, Krashen was talking. It's very important that I mentioned, by the way, because I forgot it's very important. Here it says when the input is understood, right? So I have to use the phrase, Krashen is talking not about input in general, but about comprehensible input, right? About something you understand. So his theory says if you understand enough messages in the language, then you will learn, right? So for example, if you watch videos, you need to watch videos at your level. If you watch immediately now political interviews in Dutch, you won't learn anything. And that's why I said here, you first get to the A2 level and then binge watch Netflix series, okay? If you start now, maybe you'll also learn, but it will be very slow. So he's talking about comprehensible input. But how you process comprehensible input is also important. So first, output hypothesis. This linguist, Swain, she studied French students, okay? So students who were English speakers, native speakers, but studied French. They were getting lots of comprehensible input, but their output was pretty bad, of some of them. And she therefore theorized that input lacks the need for syntax. So, for example, if you understand a lot of phrases like this one, yesterday I went home, at 3 a.m. I was asleep, you can understand those sentences perfectly because you look at yesterday and at 3 a.m. and you see, therefore, that the sentence is in the past, right? But now you've understood these sentences without inferring the past tense. So you don't need to understand grammar in order to understand sentences, is what she says. So that's maybe the reason why later on, if people read books and understand podcasts, when they start speaking, they start using the present. Yesterday I go home, right? So therefore we need practice, and that's the output hypothesis. So she says, very simply, the act of producing a language, speaking or writing, constitutes, under certain circumstances, part of the process of second language learning. So she disagrees with Krashen. She says that on a particular point, she says input is not always enough. So Krashen says it's always enough. She says, well, there's a little bit more to that. So she also agrees with the hypothesis of Krashen. She says it's super important. Like I said, everybody agrees, but she says we need more. And she says that this thing that Krashen says, namely that we only learn through input, she says it's not entirely true. She says we can also learn by speaking. Well, how? For example, if I say, yesterday I go home, and Jelle looks at me and he says, I went. I go, oh, okay, I went. So there I've learned something, right? I noticed that Jelle's face was going, what? So I noticed I was saying something wrong because I said something, right? So I learned something from speaking there. That's what's basically what she says. And that's the concept of noticing. So if you notice something is not going well, then you've learned something. And you can notice those things by output. For example, I want to talk about biology in Persian, in Dutch. You guys want to talk about biology in Dutch, but you notice that there's some words you missed. Then you've noticed, okay, that's the concept of noticing. You've noticed that you lack a few words. So now you've learned something. You've learned that there's a gap in your knowledge, and you need to look up those words, use them, and then you're doing better, right? So that's the concept of noticing. And the second one, hypothesis testing, is these are three functions, by the way, so three parts of the same hypothesis, right? So we notice the gaps in our knowledge. Two, we have some ideas, some assumptions about the language of Dutch, and we say it in the way we think is nice, but actually we see that's not correct. So for example, in English, we have a lot of words that are very similar to Dutch, but not all of them. So sometimes people say, for example, the possibiliteit, right? So they say possibility, and then they Dutchify it, they say possibiliteit. But as some of you know, in Dutch, it's mogelijkheid. So this is something it's quite hard to learn from input. So when you just try, and somebody says, no, it's mogelijkheid, then you've learned something, right? So she says you've learned something from output. And this, what just happened already, when I kind of told you about this dialogue, that's the third one. So meta-linguistic reflection is negotiation of meaning, is that you start reflecting on the words and on the structures you are using. And you don't need this reflection when you're reading and listening, but you do need it when you're speaking, right? So this is a very complicated way to say that speaking and writing makes you better in Dutch, right? That sounds like a very logical thing. Only according to Krashen, it's not the case, okay? He says you're just producing language that you've learned by reading and listening. And she disagrees. He says, no, we also learn by producing. Yes, I'll leave my own opinion away for today. She says, when you look at these three things, please notice, for you guys, please notice that the most useful output is interaction. Because the third one, the negotiation of meaning, you can do it by yourself, right? When you're writing a text. Only it's a lot faster in conversation or as when somebody checks your text. Also, the hypothesis testing. If you're saying something wrong in Dutch, you see the faces, right? You know that your assumption wasn't true. So please note that according to the output hypothesis, from that follows that interaction is very good. And that's also something that Krashen agrees with. He only says that the moment we learn is when we see the face, not when we speak, right? That's what Stephen Krashen would say. He would say, you're saying a sentence, you're not learning because of the sentence. You're learning because of the face that someone makes, and that's input. So we're actually learning from input when it comes to the output hypothesis, according to Stephen Krashen. And that's kind of their debate. For us, it's not important. Just speaking and writing is very important. Massive input is great. And here we have the practical conclusions. Speak and practice, obviously. Interact with people. Try to push yourself for output, but only if you want, okay? If you really don't want, it's okay. Then also slow down and notice. So noticing is not only there when you're speaking or when you're writing. You can also notice the past tense when you're just reading, right? So this is my advice to you, is try to slow down and notice what's happening in this sentence, what's going on. That really helps. And send messages. Because when you try to send a message, you're focusing on the meaning, not so much on the form, and you'll get an emotional connection with the language, and this helps. So please notice that the input and the output hypothesis both say that interaction is great, right? Then the way you read and listen and speak and write is also important, right? So we've looked at the input, we've looked at the output, and now we're going to look at how to process those things with the involvement load hypothesis. It's relatively new, and it claims that retention of unfamiliar words is contingent upon the involvement load of a task, the amount of need, search, and evaluation it imposes. It just says that you will remember words better if you're more involved with the language, and you will not remember them very, very easily if you're not so involved. And then he, again, has 3 points, or they, I should say, for them together, Hulsen and Lover, 2001. There's 3 parts of this. So they basically say, if you have a need to use a word or to find a word, the chances are that you'll remember it better, right? What is the best moment to learn the word water? It's when you're thirsty, right? That's what need says. Then search, it says, if you need to put in more, if you need to be more involved and put more effort to find a word, then you'll also probably remember it better. And you've probably noticed this, that when you've looked something up or Googled something, then it's easier to remember, right? That's what they tried to put into a theory with this hypothesis. And the last one is evaluation. So if you need to think about this word, if it's the good word to use or not, that means you have to evaluate. Oh, should I say it? Should I not say it? Right? That means you also remember it correctly. I remember my girlfriend, for example, she called my father a klootzak accidentally in Dutch, which is something like capron or douchebag, right? And she'll never forget this word because she said it, she saw our faces, right? That's the output hypothesis. She learned this word.
Did she say it on purpose or?
Yes, and she said it on purpose. She thought it meant something different. So when you're more involved, you'll learn better. So let's take an example. Let's say that you want to learn the Dutch words for the chess pieces, okay? And you want to learn the word for king, queen, pawn, rook, bishop, knight, etc., right? According to the involvement hypothesis, these techniques are better or worse. So in the involvement goes up. One of the worst techniques in general is making a list of words, right? Just making the list. and then, put your hand on one side and try to remember. Really, really bad, okay? Because there's no context, there's no meaning, there's no need. You're looking up the words. Okay, that's right. You don't need to evaluate. So that's not good, right? Flashcards is already a little bit better because you need to do something. You need to look at them, think about it. Then filling exercise is even a little bit better because you have to think about the sentence. You have to evaluate a little bit if this is the correct word to put there or not. Then naming the pieces. So pointing to the pieces and telling someone else, this is a rook. This is a bishop. That's already better because you're communicating. Yes? These ones are even better. Take the blah, blah, blah game. Is, for example, Jelle is your teacher. He says in Dutch, take the rook. You have to take the rook. And you tell Jelle, take the pawn. Jelle has to take the pawn. There, what you're doing, you're combining the two hypotheses, right? You're using the input hypothesis because you need to understand the word. And you're using the output hypothesis because if you say rook and he gets the bishop, well, something is wrong. So interaction is the best way to do things like this and actually remember them. Then even better is you talk, I move, is you can start playing basically. So Jelle says, move the bishop to A2. And you have to move it like that, right? It's even more complicated. Maybe another level would be to analyze a game together. Then you need to use the word rook and actually in the right moment, right? And explain, you understand where I'm going, right? So the more involvement, the better you'll probably retain the words. Then don't forget, please, that these are things that you can do, but it will take a lot of time. So let's say that you don't have a lot of time, and probably none of you have a lot of time, right? Then don't forget that also watching films and reading books will also teach you the words about pretty much everything. So if you read enough books, there will be, at one point, there will be a talk about chess and you'll find the words there. Or if you really want to know how to play chess in Dutch, you can watch a video on YouTube. And after someone is analyzing a game for 15 minutes, he will have used the word rook for so many times that you probably understand that it's the little tower thingy, right? Fundamental conclusions of the research. Let me read only part of it. So fundamental conclusions. 1, adults can learn syntax, morphosyntax, while processing natural language for meaning, okay? Even if they don't look for any rule, resulting in implicit and explicit knowledge. So what this means is, if you read and listen, you can learn Dutch completely. However, this knowledge is not robust. You'll forget it quickly. You cannot always use it. 2, we learn a lot of words from reading and or listening. Okay, so these things are very similar, just that these say you can do everything and this say you can learn a lot of words. 3, output helps strengthening and deepening your language skills, especially interaction. 4, all learning should take place in an engaging, meaningful context in order to be effective. So things like making word lists or reading super short, boring texts in a textbook, those things are really bad, okay? Then 5, more involvement, so activity or emotional connection, means more vocabulary retention. So you learn more words from involvement. Now, this is very general, but let's try to make it a little bit practical, right? Let me ask you this question. Please think about it for 1 minute. Why is it that high school students never achieve fluency in their second language? So using all the theory of today, what do you think? Ooh. Oh, wow. Wow. Somebody asking about learning Portuguese. Yeah, so everything that was in there was correct, okay? Look, first of all, it's not enough hours. So if you do 4 years, right, or 40 weeks, 2 hours per week, that's 320 hours, then you're only A2. Even if you do everything perfectly in those hours, you're only A2. Then there's no comprehensible input, because usually the teachers don't speak the second language. They speak only English or Dutch in my case. There's not enough output also, because they didn't really force us to speak a lot of French, for example, with French. And everything was also word lists, very boring dialogues, no context. So that's why, not only because I was in puberty, okay, I was badly in puberty, but also because of the word lists and the dialogues. And even if I would be completely motivated, there would be no involvement, because what a word list doesn't mean anything, right? And remember that Krashen says that we learn from input when we understand the message. But if you have a list of words, there's no message, right? Like a word list doesn't mean anything. So if you take something from today, is that you should look at things that mean something. So something that actually conveys a message, like a small text about something you like, a video about something that's interesting to you. That's what you should use for both your input and your output. And then you know that you're involved, right? Here I have a lot of conclusions. Number 1, massive input is key. 2, comprehensible, compelling content is gold. The 3 C's, okay? 3, controlled speaking practice, it helps, but it's not necessary for everyone. Grammar helps, but it's greatly overrated. It definitely helps, but if you do every grammar, for example, if you take an A2 book, okay, like Nederlands in Gang or something, if you do all the exercises in the book, you'll be super slow. You'll be way too slow. So you should do a little bit of grammar, not a lot. Meaning is more important than form, because we were talking about messages, right? So messages are meaning. All skills reinforce each other. I didn't tell you before, but I encountered a lot of studies that show that if you read and write, it will also improve your speaking, just like Krashen says. So if you only read books from now on, okay, guys, if you only read books, your speaking in Dutch gets better. That doesn't sound logical, but it's true, okay? Then next one, we learn words best from context, right? And something also new I didn't tell you, we need to see a word about 7 to 10 times before you actually learn it. And this is, again, why word lists and grammar exercises don't really work, because usually you do them once or twice for one exercise and then you move on, you'll never see it again, right? But it doesn't work like that. You forget, you have to see it again. Then you can learn a language by watching videos, yes. And Dutch videos with Dutch subtitles are best. These are a lot of conclusions from now on. I hope this is already useful for someone that wants to go to bed right now. Let's go back to this one. We know that the language consists of these 3 things, and these are the things we looked at. So listening and reading will reinforce your speaking and writing, and then a little bit of speaking and writing will also make you better at everything. Grammar really helps, so please study grammar, but don't focus on it. We forgot pronunciation, right? No, we didn't forget, don't worry. Pronunciation is completely different from all the other things because it's something physical. And I noticed that many students don't realize this. But pronunciation is something that you do with your lips and your throat and your facial muscles, right? So it doesn't work like the other things, right? Just input or something is not enough. You have to do it. So my advice is repeat out loud. So whenever you hear words and you're not sure if you hear it correctly, just repeat it. Close your eyes and feel what you're doing with your mouth also. So try to close your eyes and see where is your tongue when you say the word. And that will make you more conscious. And go back to the basics. So even for the B2 level people, especially if you're German, you probably didn't study a lot of pronunciation. And that's okay. But it makes sense. So once a month, once every 2 months, just go back to the alphabet and listen. Because the German and Dutch is actually not the same, the alphabet. We pronounce the letters a little bit differently. And if you notice those things, again, the concept of noticing, it makes sense to practice that. Yeah. What doesn't work for pronunciation, but often people recommend it, is reading out loud. So if you read out loud by yourself, your pronunciation will not get better. There's been a couple of studies on this. So it only works when you're listening and then repeating. And then you can have the text if you want. But if you only read without listening, then you'll just practice your own bad French pronunciation when you're learning Dutch, right? So then we've done everything about pronunciation. That's all I have for pronunciation. There's a lot more to say about it, of course, but I don't want to get into specific techniques because that's for another masterclass.